Sometimes Twitter will drop a beautiful thing into your lap. A person who is so out of left field, so wrong, he doesn't know how wrong he is. Okay, that's pretty much everybody on Twitter, all the time. But today I'm talking about this thread by Sock Done Left, everybody's favorite Dunning-Kruger socialist femboy. This isn't exactly how I wanted to start my morning, but I've got my coffee ready, and now is about as good a time as any. That capturing the culture quote from Gramsci is fake, or why the conservative intellectual ecosystem is broken. If you're a lefty, you've seen this Gramsci quote. In the New Order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. It's fake. You won't find this quote in Gramsci's writings. It's a bad summary of Gramsci from Wardner 1996, Unholy Alliance, an insane screed about how Freemasons control the world. Why does this matter? First, the conservative intellectual ecosystem is broken. I counted over 50 uses of this fake quote in major conservative publications by prominent conservatives. Not one fact-checked it. Billionaire backers means that rightists don't need to care about truth. Rightists claim that leftists seize control of the institutions and use that to justify seizing control back. In short, rightist pundits use a fake Gramsci quote created by an anti-Freemason conspiracist to justify the existence of a secret communist conspiracy, which they use to justify destroying claimed leftist institutions. In shorter, the conservative intellectual ecosystem is broken. Rightist grifters don't have to care about the truth. Now, just so I'm not accused of being bad faith, Sock Done Left did go into detail on his Substack, which you can check out for yourself if you like. But having read the whole article myself, I can confirm that the Twitter thread is a pretty accurate summary of it. I can additionally confirm that the information in the article is also mostly accurate, but also that Sock Done Left misses the point, and it's actually very easy to see where he goes off the rails. But let's first start by giving credit where credit is due. He's entirely correct when he says this quotation that conservatives tend to attribute to Gramsci is mostly false. Of these words, socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the New Order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. Only that first line, socialism is the religion that must overwhelm Christianity, were actually Gramsci's own words. That passage comes from an article Gramsci wrote in the Italian socialist newspaper Avanti in 1916, titled Odissea e Fede, or Audacity and Faith. Listen, just because my dad's side of the family comes from Italy doesn't mean that I know how to pronounce any of this shit. The context is, Gramsci is publicly responding to the claims of a Christian socialist from a different socialist publication, who thinks that socialism should become Christian. Christian socialists believe that capitalism is rooted in the sin of greed, and that Jesus, who lowered himself to the level of the destitute and fed the poor, was a socialist himself. They also believe that the shared insular economies of monasteries were an ideal socialist model for the collectivization of private property. The idea that all humans, despite their earthly differences, are equal under God is an idea well adapted to socialism. Gramsci's response to the Christian socialist was this: socialism is precisely the religion that must kill Christianity. Religion in the sense that it is also a faith, which has its mystics and practices. Religion because it has replaced in the consciences to the transcendental God of Catholics, trust in man and in his best energies as the only spiritual reality. Our gospel is modern philosophy, the one that does without the hypothesis of God in the vision of the universe, what only in history lays its foundations, in history of which we are the creatures for the past and the creators for the future. In other words, socialism must kill Christianity because socialism fulfills a similar function. As a secular religion, it doesn't deal with the divine, but it does provide an ethical system and a blueprint of the universe, which are at odds with the Christian one. For Gramsci, Marx's historical materialist analytical method is how we determine what we should do next, rather than God's law. The rest of that incorrect quotation, in the New Order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society, was never spoken or written by Gramsci. Sock Done Left claims that this quote first comes from a 1996 book, Unholy Alliances, The Secret Plan and the Secret People Working to Destroy America by James Wardner. This book, which I admit I haven't read, seems to contain a lot of stuff about the Freemasons secretly controlling the world from the shadows, and how all elections are rigged, and how the Catholic Church has been infiltrated, and all that sort of stuff. Wardner doesn't seem to think that the Jews are behind the New World Order, though, which is a bit surprising. That's the one conspiracy theory he hasn't bought into. The rest of the quote comes from Wardner paraphrasing Gramsci, and not actually Gramsci's own words. This happens quite a lot in the internet quoting business, to be honest. The famous socialist quote, "The last capitalist shall sell us the rope we hang him with," is attributed online to the writing of both Marx and Stalin, but actually comes from a private note written by Lenin on a scrap of paper, later repeated by Yuri Annenkov, a Russian artist, who claimed to have seen it. Wardner wrote 2 books on this topic, Unholy Alliances and a second one, The Planned Destruction of America, which seems to be more of the same, communists and Freemasons. There's videos of him talking about this stuff from back in the 90s. Wardner died in 2016, and would you believe it, he was a Florida man. In other words, Wardner is rather inconsequential to the story, all things considered. But this quote, commonly attributed to Gramsci, for the most part, did come from this obscure Freemason book where the author, whose ideas are more than a little dubious, gave his interpretation of Gramsci's views. The question then is, despite Wardner's eccentricities, is this summary of Gramsci's view accurate? What did Gramsci himself actually believe? Antonio Gramsci was born on the island of Sardinia in the Kingdom of Italy. He suffered from health problems all his life, due to what modern medicine now believes was pot disease, which is a form of tuberculosis that can deform the spine. Gramsci was an ubermanlet due to the disease, less than 5 feet tall as an adult, but he was intellectually gifted, and he won a scholarship to the University of Turin in northern Italy. In his early years, Gramsci was a proponent of Sardinian nationalism, believing Sardinia's poverty and mistreatment to be the fault of the central Italian government, which was focusing its attention on the rapidly industrializing north. But after attending university, he began to believe that socialism and not nationalism would ultimately solve the problems of the Sardinian working class. While at the University of Turin, Gramsci was influenced by a wide spectrum of ideas, from Benedetto Croce, who at the time was one of Italy's most well-respected liberal thinkers, to Giovanni Gentile, who is most notable for becoming the most prolific philosopher of fascism. From 1917, socialist rioting in Turin had led to the arrest of many notable socialists. This left holes in Turin's socialist scene, which Antonio Gramsci's fierce intellect allowed him to fill. He was elected to the Socialist Party's Provisional Committee, and eventually set up the newspaper that attracted Lenin's attention, L'Ordine Nuovo, or in English, The New Order. Lenin viewed Gramsci's group as being the closest faction in the Italian socialist community that was equivalent to the Bolsheviks of Russia, and granted him his support at the Third International. This was due to Gramsci's support of the Italian Workers' Councils, which had appeared spontaneously during the General Strike of 1919, organizations that Gramsci had conceptualized as being like the Soviets in Russia. These councils are actually quite important in the development of Gramsci's ideas, so let's talk about them for a bit. This era of Italian history is known as the Biennio Rosso, or in English, the 2 Red Years, a period of significant economic and social instability lasting from 1919 to 1920. As I mentioned in my video, The 3 Forms of Fascism, Italy incurred great economic cost to mobilize for World War I, and at the end of the war, when all those soldiers returned home, they discovered that with their addition to the workforce, there were too many workers and not enough work. High unemployment and high inflation led to a significant increase in the price of basic goods. Large swaths of Italian society ended up joining various revolutionary groups during this period, from the Italian Socialist Party, which Gramsci was a member of, to the Italian Syndicalist Union, which advocated for Italy's entry into the war in the first place, to the Italian Fighting League, which was the precursor to Mussolini's Black Shirts. This period saw widespread striking among both city laborers and rural peasants, street violence, and eventually workers seizing factories with force after their owners tried to lock them out. These workers created the Italian worker councils that Gramsci viewed as being the equivalent of Italian Soviets. But the rest of the Italian Socialist Party didn't agree. According to William Peltz's book on the period, Against Capitalism, the workers' councils didn't just want to negotiate with the owners of the factories. They wanted to control the factories directly, with the council structure taking the place of the owners. A demand that, despite Gramsci's support, the Italian Socialist Party did not endorse. By 1921, the economy had become so disrupted and unproductive that the Italian working class was hit with mass layoffs and wage cuts. The workers' councils fell apart, and a lot of the people who supported them, feeling betrayed by the lack of direct action on the part of the Italian Socialist Party, would end up joining the Italian Fighting League and following Mussolini instead, as during this same period, they had proven themselves more than capable of engaging in direct violence against the liberal state. In fact, while Mussolini's initial backers were Italian veterans of the First World War, his first huge upswell of popular grassroots support were primarily farmers, factory workers, and middle-class laborers who were fed up with the Italian Socialist Party's all-talk, no-action reputation when it came to revolutionary action. It was the influence of these workers' councils that partially led Mussolini to adopt George Sorel's national syndicalism philosophy when he began to conceptualize a more coherent fascist ideology. For Antonio Gramsci, all of this meant that he believed he was ultimately correct about the revolutionary potential of the factory workers' councils, and that the Italian Socialist Party had missed a vital chance to secure a revolution, something that Mussolini had taken advantage of. This was not the only split between Gramsci and the rest of the Italian Socialist Party. The militant group Arditi del Popolo, or the People's Daring Ones, socialist thugs who were tasked with confronting Mussolini's equally thuggish black shirts in the streets, was denounced by the Italian Socialist Party, but supported by Gramsci and Lenin as proletarian violence against fascism. By 1922, Gramsci was called to Moscow to receive official Russian support. It was here that he would meet his wife, with whom he had 2 sons. Gramsci would never see his youngest. Lenin instructed Gramsci to return to Italy, take leadership of the Italian Socialist Party, unite Italy's leftists, and provide a bulwark against fascism. While Gramsci was out of the country, Mussolini purged many of the leaders of the Italian Socialist Party, making Gramsci's task of taking control a lot easier when he returned. However, Gramsci made little progress in uniting Italy's left, because Mussolini's fascism proved to be significantly more popular among the working class. The revolutionary fervor of the proletariat against the liberal state was fulfilled through Mussolini's embracing of street violence, while the property and profit of the bourgeois was tentatively respected as long as they followed the direction of the fascists, through the national syndicalist model Mussolini had imposed on them. It's no surprise to me that Mussolini was able to attract so many socialists, anarchists, and working-class members to the fledgling fascism, despite their obvious differences. George Sorel famously stated that Mussolini's blending of the national and the social had made fascism a completely new philosophy outside of the understanding of the socialist dialectic, and that Mussolini was solving the contradictions of capitalism by destroying both the proletariat and the bourgeois as distinct classes, leaving only the state and its organs in their place. The popular view of fascism in its day was that it was the next political step of progress beyond socialism, a notion among Italy's working class that Antonio Gramsci failed to shake with his own activism. By September 11, 1926, Gino Lucetti, an anarchist with the People's Daring Ones, attempted to assassinate Mussolini by throwing a bomb at his limo during a public appearance. This attempt on his life, along with others in the same year, led to the abolishment of the Italian Socialist Party and the creation of OVRA, the Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism, the fascist secret police in Italy. All Italian Socialist Party members, including Gramsci, were rounded up and imprisoned. There is some evidence that the fascists staged at least a few of the attacks on Mussolini's life as a pretense for gaining power, but the Lucetti bomb-throwing event is firmly established as not a false flag, but a real assassination attempt. In any case, it gave Mussolini the justification to finally wash away the last remnants of the old parliamentary democracy, and Gramsci, as the last remaining nexus of fascist resistance, was washed away along with it. The fascists recognized that Gramsci posed a significant threat to their movement due to his intellect. His prosecutor at trial famously stated, "For 20 years, we must stop this brain from functioning." Gramsci survived 11 years behind bars, before finally dying at the age of 46. What killed him is debated. While there is no doubt that the fascists treated him exceptionally poorly behind bars, his situation was also exacerbated by his lifelong poor health. One of the forewords of the prison notebooks states that Mussolini moved Gramsci from prison to the hospital near the end of his life to make it look like he died of natural causes, a gambit that ultimately didn't work. And I guess that's as good a time as any to start talking about the prison notebooks. The prison notebooks are the most influential pieces of socialist theory that Antonio Gramsci contributed to the movement. They are a disorganized and often unfinished collection of essays, spread out across 33 notebooks, written entirely while under fascist guard. Gramsci spent his 11 years behind bars, alternating between a jail cell, a doctor's office, and eventually, due to his declining health and international outcry, in exile where he was permitted to go on short walks and was given magazines to read. This wasn't really freedom, though, as his walks were monitored by the fascists. All of his reading materials were pre-screened, and his letters to his family were read before they were delivered by Gramsci's sister-in-law. As a result, Gramsci had to be careful about what he wrote, as the fascist guards could, at any time, decide to read what he was up to, and they occasionally did. So Gramsci had to couch his language using more generalized terms. For example, Gramsci tends to use the phrase dominant group when talking about the bourgeois. The socialists have a language of their own in a sense, with terms like bourgeois, proletariat, means of production, and Gramsci avoided using them as much as possible. The prison notebooks were published with each essay being introduced by either Quinton Hoare or Jeffrey Noel Smith, the translators, each offering their own interpretation of the writing. Therefore, in order to avoid censorship by his fascist jailers, a lot of Gramsci's writing in the prison notebooks is indirect. In fact, the most famous example of this is that meme that began Sock-Done Left's Twitter thread. The quote being referenced here in this image of Bart and Homer is another of Gramsci's most famous lines. "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." I can see why it became a quote. It's quite poetic and evocative, and sometimes people use it to try to draw links between Gramsci and Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, by pointing out that Goebbels said in 1939, "We know today the old world is dying and we are seeing the struggle for a new world." But there's no link here. Before the prison notebooks were published, nobody outside of Gramsci, his friends who smuggled them out, and the low-level fascist guards who read them even knew of their existence. It's much more likely that because fascism and socialism are both modernist ideologies interested in revolution and rebirth, the wiping clean of old orders, and the construction of a new society, a new man, Gramsci and Goebbels appealed to the same sentiments out of coincidence. The original form of Gramsci's Monsters quote is, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." What are these morbid symptoms? Gramsci doesn't really say. The next sentence reads, "This paragraph should be completed by some observations which I made on the so-called problem of the younger generation." Like I said, a lot of these essays went unfinished. So, what did he mean by morbid symptoms? Some people think that Gramsci meant the emergence of fascism in the face of revolutionary worker fervor and the failure of the Italian Socialist Party in capitalizing on the opportunity. However, other people think that he meant the Italian Socialist Party's ultra-left-wing turn at the Third International, abandoning their liberal and social democratic allies at Lenin's encouragement, under the misguided belief that fascism was going to collapse all on its own within months. There's no clear answer here. The point I'm getting at is, in actually examining the content of the prison notebooks, you have to read between the lines a bit more than you might otherwise. Gramsci's not going to come out and say what he's advocating, the way that Karl Marx did in the Communist Manifesto. And I know that Sock-Done Left's whole argument hinges on, but Gramsci didn't specifically say that, but come on, you're a socialist. You're used to hearing dog whistles everywhere, from edgy jokes about the Holocaust to stone toss comics to gamer words. Hell, you even made an entire other article about dog whistling, what it is, how to spot it, why it's bad. Oh, except you don't think it's bad, as long as your side is the one doing it, of course. Listen, if you're straining yourself to read between the lines so hard that you think people like Sargon, or hell, even somebody as milquetoast as Tim Pool are fascists, then you can read between the lines a little bit for Antonio Gramsci as well. When Sock-Done Left said, correctly, that the quote conservatives throw around was a false one, I replied on Twitter with, "It's true this quote is fake, but the idea behind it is absolutely Gramscian, despite what SDL claims." The section, "The Formation of the Intellectuals," from the prison notebooks, outlines Gramsci's call for socialists to subvert morality-creating cultural institutions. He replied to me with, "Provide a quotation." In that essay, which is mostly descriptive with few prescriptions, Gramsci says nothing like that. He then cites the summary of the essay, provided by the translator, which basically says that the working class can organically create its own intellectual to counter the bourgeois intellectual, provide their own ideas outside of bourgeois control, and begin to build counter-hegemony. He then cites Gramsci describing his own newspaper's goal of creating that new type of working class intellectual, even highlighting this passage. One of the most important characteristics of any group that is developing towards dominance is its struggle to assimilate and to conquer ideologically, the traditional intellectuals. But this assimilation and conquest is made quicker and more efficacious the more the group in question succeeds in simultaneously elaborating its own organic intellectuals. Now, I don't know why Sock-Done Left thought this was an own. Gramsci is describing a portion of Lenin's dual power theory here, where socialists should build up working class alternatives to the various components of bourgeois society. Gramsci's only talking about intellectuals, but Lenin applied dual power theory to all of society's institutions, so that these alternatives are ready to go when bourgeois society falls to the revolution. In this quote, Gramsci is describing how a dominant group maintains ideological control over society using their intellectuals. And so, a subversive group has to create their own intellectuals with their own ideas as part of countering the effect. Sock-Done Left is technically correct when he says that even though Gramsci describes what's going on here, he doesn't take the final step and explicitly come out and say that's what socialists should do. For example, at the beginning of the essay, he writes, "The capitalist entrepreneur creates alongside himself the industrial technician, the specialist in political economy, the organizers of a new culture, of a new legal system, etc." He doesn't end the statement with, "And we should build up our own counters to do this because, remember the fascist guards looking over his shoulder?" The prison notebooks mainly consists of detailed insights into how, in Gramsci's view, the bourgeois delicately controlled the various knobs and levers of society to keep themselves in power. It's only due to circumstance that he was required to leave the final step of the revolutionary process, the call to act on this understanding, in the hands of the reader. The main contribution that Antonio Gramsci made to socialist theory in the prison notebooks is the concept of cultural hegemony. Is it hegemony or hegemony? I'll use hegemony. Marxian socialism had a predictive element to it, that the socialist revolution would inevitably happen, just as feudalism had collapsed into capitalism before it, as a natural part of the march of progress. By the early 20th century, it was widely adopted by socialists that Marx was wrong about this. Socialism split into a number of post-Marxist schools of thought. One that we've spoken about extensively on this channel was Sorelianism, where George Sorel planted the seeds for fascism through his belief that a revolution against international capital had to be a nationalist one. Leninism, meanwhile, consists of Lenin's belief that a group of socialist intellectuals, known as the vanguard, had to control the state and re-educate the people with the proper political consciousness before any true socialism could appear. Gramscian thought, however, is different. Gramsci believed that the reason the workers did not revolt against the bourgeois as Marx had predicted is because they were subsumed in bourgeois culture. The bourgeois propagated its own values into the minds of the proletariat in the form of what we call common sense, making them act out cultural values that were against their own material interests. A simplistic example is, you might be told as a child that stealing from a shop is immoral for a number of reasons, religious, economic. But Gramscians would argue that it's only immoral because the bourgeois wants you to think it's immoral, because they have something to gain if you don't steal. In this view, all of the values of a capitalist society serve to prevent a workers' revolution, while the society in question presents those values as normal or natural or obvious when they are in fact imposed. Gramsci identified the two halves that propagate this bourgeois culture, using two different methods. The first he called political society, the police, the army, the legal system, the government. These institutions spread bourgeois culture through force. These are the components of society that will come for you if you don't accept and live by bourgeois culture. The second he called civil society, the family, the schools, the churches, the unions, the media. These institutions don't use force, but they secure consent from the people through a combination of incentives and social pressures. In this way, the people spread the same bourgeois culture to each other that prevents them from revolting against capitalism. Gramsci believed that working-class intellectuals, separate from the traditional intellectuals of bourgeois society, needed to develop an entirely separate value system and ideology in order to be able to combat the cultural hegemony the bourgeois held over society. This development of an alternative morality and culture to challenge bourgeois hegemony is what Gramsci called the war of position, contrasted with the war of maneuver, which is a direct revolution. Gramsci theorized that in Russia, a war of position to dismantle bourgeois hegemony was not necessary before a war of maneuver could take place, because Russia's bourgeois had never actually achieved any hegemony. This was not the case in more industrialized, centralized, and urbanized states, making the development of alternative culture and morality a necessity before any direct revolution could be successful. Gramsci specifically described this process with the word subversive, and how even peasants who had not yet fostered any class consciousness were still reflexively subversive when encountering civil servants working for the modern state. These peasants didn't have the education to understand the modern state, but they did intuitively know that the local civil servant who came around was not somebody to be trusted. This instinctive reflex was, for Gramsci, indicative of the underlying desire for the working class to be free of bourgeois hegemony. In one of his newspaper articles, Gramsci also chided Mussolini for claiming that the latter could ever be considered truly subversive. From a modern perspective, that's actually quite strange, listening to socialists and fascists argue over who the true subversive is, wanting to claim the label because it's considered positive. Nowadays, both of them try desperately to ditch the title, and claim that the other is the one who's lying constantly. Here's where we get to what is, for me personally, the really interesting bit. In the Twitter thread, Sock Done Left claims that the conservative intellectual ecosystem is broken, that all of these right-wing creators and talking heads are using this false Gramsci quote to spread the idea that socialists have the goal of infiltrating institutions to turn the culture socialist as a prelude to a revolution, the war of position before the war of maneuver, and that this is the justification the right is leaning on to seize the institutions back. And where Sock Done Left is correct is not only that the Gramsci quote is false, but also that Gramsci never explicitly said, seize the institutions and cultural production and turn them socialist, again due to the fact that he was writing in a fascist prison. Most of the prison notebooks are descriptions, not prescriptions. It's Gramsci outlining what he sees the bourgeois doing to establish cultural hegemony, and what working class intellectuals could do to create counter-hegemony. He never actually says, do it, just like a person who doxes somebody never actually says, go harass them, but we can read between the lines. But Gramsci did make some overt prescriptions that slipped by the censors. The most important one was that although the working class intellectuals were tasked with the creation of a new type of education, morality, and culture, they were actually not instructed to introduce Marxist ideology into the consciousness of the proletariat as a set of foreign notions, but instead they were to co-opt existing intellectual activities of the working class and make them inherently critical of the status quo. It's possible that Gramsci did not advocate for direct Marxist education out of fear of the censors, hoping that any future comrades would also be able to read between the lines. But it's also possible that Gramsci did not believe that direct propagandizing would be effective, that a true awakening of class consciousness would require dismantling bourgeois hegemony first and letting the working class's natural subversiveness blossom all on its own. But all of this is a far cry from saying that the rightoids of today are lying grifters who don't care about the truth, that their intellectual ecosystem is broken. Sock Done Left explicitly states in the thread that rightist pundits use a fake Gramsci quote to justify the existence of a secret communist conspiracy. But then, in his article, he says that Gramsci and those socialists descended from him argued for socialists attempting to construct dual power structures to win the coercion battle, along with gradually moving culture production leftward to win the consent battle. Sock Done Left literally says right here that what the right wing says Gramsci believed in that fake quote is actually what Gramsci believed. Conservatives love to trot out these quotes in order to suggest that leftists are engaged in a grand conspiracy to take over institutions from within. Yeah, but that's true though. Gramsci wrote it. You even say in your article that you actually want there to be a secret cabal of leftists controlling everything. Leftists are engaged in a conspiracy to take over institutions from within. They may not be as effective as you want them to be, or as the right says that they are, but putting aside the effectiveness, does the effort exist? The only possible answer to that is yes. Lots of people who talk about critical race theory online have no idea what it is. Those few people who have read the writings of critical theorists, however, all report that they are directly descended from Gramscian socialism. Sargon did something like 10 videos going over the various components of the critical race theory Bible, and those are worthwhile videos to watch for sure. But I found personally that when I was watching them, I wasn't actually learning very much. Sorry, Sargon. I was instead remembering it. Because for me, this is all stuff that I had already personally encountered and kind of forgotten about. In the first-year university course, Introduction to Critical Theory, that I took back in 2007. Here's my textbook from that class, Critical Theory Today by Lois Tyson, 2nd edition, though I understand there's been several newer versions of the book since I've graduated. Let's trace the genealogy of the post-Gramscian socialist movement. The Hungarian thinker György Lukács is one of the most influential philosophers of what would eventually become critical theory. He had a similar intellectual development as Antonio Gramsci. He went off to university and discovered the philosophies of Marx, Sorel, Hegel, Kierkegaard, and Gentile. The Russian Revolution of 1917 inspired him to become a committed Marxist, and though he was somewhat critical of Leninism, he nonetheless became a commissar in the short-lived 1919 Hungarian Soviet Republic, and committed atrocities you'd expect from that station. After that state was crushed in the Hungarian Civil War, Lukács fled to Italy. Gramsci and Lukács were in Vienna at the same time in the 1920s, and though they never met, Gramsci's ideas were introduced to Lukács through a mutual comrade, the Belgian-Russian anarchist Victor Serge, who really has nothing to his name other than getting Gramsci's ideas out there. Serge moved back to Russia, opposed Lenin, was exiled, and died. Lukács traveled to the Soviet Union in 1933 to take up a spot in a Moscow university, and was not allowed to leave, first due to the outbreak of the Second World War, and secondly due to being exiled in Stalin's Great Purge. By the time he returned to Hungary in 1945, it was again a Soviet state, and he joined the Hungarian Communist Party, taking on an administrative role. Though Lukács was ultimately critical of Stalin and the Soviet regimes of Eastern Europe as not being true socialism, he kept those beliefs under wraps until after Stalin's death. He spent his remaining years advocating for socialism, but critical of its current form. György Lukács contributed a lot to political theory and history. I've only just skimmed over his biography. But what concerns us today is his involvement in the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School began as a physical school, the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, but it eventually became a school of thought. Lukács was one of the school's founders, and published a work that is just as influential as Gramsci's prison notebooks, History and Class Consciousness. In this book, Lukács argues that Marxism is not only a theory of political economy that improves upon its bourgeois predecessors by advancing the dialectic, nor is it only a scientific sociology like the natural sciences, but it is also a critique, a self-conscious transformation of society. The old Marxist purists argued that Marxism made philosophy obsolete, but these new Marxists, commonly called Western Marxists, like Lukács and Gramsci, claimed that Marxism preserves the truths of philosophy until revolution can transform them into reality. This process was explored by Marx, but was popularized by Lukács using the term reification. To reify something means to take something that is abstract and make it a real object. To use a modern comparison, what objectification is to people, reification is to ideas. The Frankfurt School was heavily influenced by the rise of fascism in Europe in two ways. First, the intellectuals of the school applied their interpretations of Marxist political theory to try and explain why fascism, and not socialism, had been the result of widespread working-class revolt. Secondly, when Germany became too unsafe for them to continue their work as the Nazis rose to power, the school was moved to the United States, along with most of its members, though Georgi Lucas was a notable exception who remained behind in Europe. Everyone actually involved in the Frankfurt School is notable enough that they each deserve a video in their own right, especially Herbert Marcuse, another person Sargon's covered over at Lotus Eaters, and there just isn't enough time to talk about them all right now. But the leader of the Frankfurt School in America, the German sociologist Max Horkheimer, wrote in his 1937 work, Traditional and Critical Theory, that critical theory as an intellectual tradition was a social critique meant to affect political change and foster intellectual enlightenment, an idea that is likely descended from Gramsci through Lucas. Meanwhile, the Frankfurt School had influenced a community of French intellectuals, who, while not a part of the school, were still Western Marxists and critical theorists. Jean-Paul Sartre, a prominent existentialist, his partner Simone de Beauvoir, who pretty much kickstarted feminism's second wave with her 1949 book The Second Sex. Jacques Derrida, who developed the philosophy of deconstruction. Michael Foucault, probably the most famous postmodernist of all time. Again, I've got a lot to say about each of these people, and now's not the time, but even a cursory glance will recognize the Gramscian influence in their philosophy. They all, in their own way, advocated for the critiquing of society through its institutions to subvert hegemonic culture and create space for change. Probably the most blatant Gramscian activist of this period was Rudi Dutschke, which is ironic because Dutschke never actually mentioned Gramsci at all in any of his writing. But like everyone else, during his time at university, he was heavily influenced by pretty much everyone I just listed. All the thinkers of the Frankfurt School, all the French critical theorists, Georgi Lucas and Mao Zedong and Lenin, and it's in Dutschke's ideas that things really begin to take shape. Dutschke coined the phrase the long march through the institutions to describe the necessity for socialist revolutionaries to subvert capitalist domination of society by taking up positions from within these institutions and slowly turning them towards socialism. By the way, even as Sockdon Left said that conservatives were grifters for thinking that this was a socialist goal, he cited Dutschke in the article saying that this was his goal. It is unreal how these people will piss on your face and tell you it's raining. Dutschke took the phrase long march through the institutions from Mao Zedong's Long March, which was a strategic retreat that the Chinese Red Army undertook in order to evade the pursuit of the Chinese nationalists. It was a grueling event in the Chinese Communist Party's history, covering over 9,000 kilometers across 370 days through the toughest terrain of Western China. And by the end of it, Mao Zedong had been cemented in the minds of the Chinese communists as their undisputed leader. Dutschke's use of the phrase Long March was meant to evoke the idea of a protracted, bitter struggle against capitalist forces seeking them out, and how evasion and subversion across a large enough time frame would lead to a prestigious victory. Herbert Marcuse of the Frankfurt School explicitly supported Rudi Dutschke's idea of a long march through the institutions, writing in Counter-Revolution and Revolt, working against the established institutions while working within them, but not simply by boring from within, rather by doing the job, learning how to program and read computers, how to teach at all levels of education, how to use mass media, how to organize production, how to design, etc., and at the same time preserving one's own consciousness in working with others. The Long March includes the concentrated effort to build up counter-institutions. They have long been an aim of the movement, but the lack of funds was greatly responsible for their weakness and their inferior quality. They must be made competitive. This is especially important for the development of radical free media. The fact that the radical left has no equal access to the great chains of information and indoctrination is largely responsible for its isolation. Similarly, with the development of independent schools and free universities, they can be competitive, that is to say, apt to counteract establishment education, only where they fill a vacuum of where their quality is not only different but also superior. The collection of large funds for the operation of effective counter-institutions requires compromises. The time of the wholesale rejection of the liberals has passed, or has not yet come. Radicalism has much to gain from the legitimate protest against the war, inflation, unemployment, from the defense of civil rights, even perhaps from a lesser evil in local elections. The ground for the building of a united front is shifting and sometimes dirty, but it is there. I have stressed the key role which the universities play in the present period. They can still function as institutions for the training of counter-cadres. The restructuring necessary for the attainment of this goal means more than decisive student participation and non-authoritarian learning. Though Dutschke had no knowledge of Gramsci, Marcuse certainly did due to his involvement in the Frankfurt School. And though Dutschke would ultimately have little effect on any socialist movement, suffering from a seizure while in the bath and drowning at the age of 39, Marcuse would adopt the long march through the institutions into his own work and carry it forward with the rest of the Frankfurt School.
Reagan is about to make his acceptance speech, presumably. He's at the Century Plaza Hotel in Los Angeles. Here is Ronald Reagan coming out.
In the book, The Critical Turn in Education, From Marxist Critique to Post-Structuralist Feminism to Critical Theories of Race, it's described that the Frankfurt School entered into a period of decline, correlated with neoconservatives becoming the dominant American rightist faction, beating out paleoconservatives and libertarians in the right-wing civil war of the late 1970s. As a result, critical theory as a discipline began to slowly fracture into separate strains over the years. Post-colonial theory, queer theory, feminist theory, and most famously, at least in modern terms, critical race theory. I was lucky. My textbook included a section on all of them. Yes, critical race theory is one of the right wing's current boogeymen, though the trans stuff seems to be currently overtaking it for the top spot. And before you ask, yes, there is a form of critical trans theory too. It's included in queer theory. And honestly, all of these different branches function pretty much exactly the same way. And they can all have their lineage traced back through the Frankfurt School to Herbert Marcuse, to Max Horkheimer, to Georgi Lukács, to Antonio Gramsci. The core Gramscian idea still remains in critical theory. In order to subvert bourgeois hegemony, you must construct counter-hegemony. This means subversive intellectuals who create alternative morality and produce alternative cultural output. These would form into organic appearing countercultures that would drum up revolutionary fervor in the mind of the normal working class person. And even if it didn't, it would leave them highly critical of their own society and weak to further propaganda. It's pretty much the same thing that Yuri Bezmenov described the Soviet Union doing through infiltration of Western academia, but with one big difference. The Soviet Active Measures program was designed to demoralize an enemy population with planted agents. The critical theorists, meanwhile, weren't planted by the Soviets. They engage in subversive action in the hope of fostering a homegrown revolution, not beholden to foreign socialists. This book is Critical Race Theory, the Key Writings That Form the Movement. It's a long, boring, arcane tome that I am certain most conservatives have never even read, despite constantly citing this movement. But it is important. It's a collection of essays compiled by Kimberly Crenshaw, a civil rights advocate and the creator of what we now know as intersectional theory. She coined the term intersectionality in 1989 as a way to describe the oppression of African American women. Crenshaw noticed that oppression based on race and oppression based on sex were separate but intertwined. And in the wake of the dissolution of the Frankfurt School in America and the fracturing of critical theory as a discipline into separate groups, she found that she needed new language to describe the intersection of race and sex. Though the majority of prominent black activists of the second half of the 20th century were all students of the original American Frankfurt School members, most notably Herbert Marcuse mentoring Angela Davis, Kimberly Crenshaw was not one of them. Crenshaw came to the idea of intersectionality after reading the writing of black activists not descended from the Frankfurt School, like Sojourner Truth and Anna Julia Hayward Cooper. Crenshaw observed during her time at university that the intersection of race and gender was not well understood, and that rather than the overlapping oppressions simply stacking up, gender gave racial oppression a unique dynamic, and vice versa. However, Kimberly Crenshaw would eventually work with descendants of the Frankfurt School like Angela Davis, and they would influence each other. Crenshaw would give them intersectionality, and they would give in return Gramsci's cultural hegemony. Also, I know I'm dropping a lot of names in you right now. They really all do deserve a deep dive, and it can't be today. The TLDR of Angela Davis is that she's a black activist whose legally owned guns were given to the perpetrators of an armed takeover of a courtroom and the execution of a judge in California in 1970, as well as a communist who believed that the prisoners of the Soviet Union and its satellite states deserved to be purged because they were Zionist fascists and opponents of socialism. Yes, those were her words. She has a long history of supporting political violence, repressive governments, and genuinely awful organizations in the name of feminism, socialism, and black liberation. In the modern day, she has taken on the public persona of being like any other aged black activist, her violent past having largely been forgotten. Meanwhile, Kimberly Crenshaw's area of expertise was in law, and she applied Gramsci's cultural hegemony to that sphere, creating critical legal theory. She theorized that laws exist to maintain society's status quo, and that insofar as that status quo is bigoted, the law serves to codify that bigotry. In this way, the liberals' colorblindness will always be racist, in Crenshaw's view anyway, because that colorblindness must necessarily insist on an equality that doesn't exist. For Crenshaw, if the law treats everyone equally without prejudice, then it is blind to the reason as to why, say, more black people are locked up per capita than white people in America. And for Crenshaw, the solution to that problem is a Gramscian one: subvert the process and develop counter-hegemony. Critical race theory, and critical gender theory, and queer theory, all of it is all descended from this origin. This is why so many leftists will say, why are you so pissed that CRT is being taught in schools? It's just a legal thing. You don't even know what CRT is. And yeah, a lot of conservatives don't know what CRT is. But this is why you should be pissed. It's anti-liberal. Therefore, critical race theory, being Gramscian in origin, posits that in America, bourgeois hegemony is white hegemony, that countercultural action to foster liberation must be through black culture, and that liberalism's attempt to create a neutral playing field through colorblind, value-neutral policies only serves to reinforce white hegemony by not explicitly privileging black people. Kimberly Crenshaw has no problem in her own writing making this explicitly clear. In her article, Race, Reform, and Retrenchment, she writes, "Oppressed people sometimes advance by creating ideological and political crisis, but the form of the crisis-producing challenge must reflect the institutional logic of the system." Gramsci called the struggle a war of position, and he regarded it as the most appropriate strategy for change in Western societies. According to Gramsci, direct challenges to the dominant class accomplish little if ideology plays such a central role in establishing authority that the legitimacy of the dominant regime is not challenged. Consequently, the challenges in such societies is to create a counter-hegemony by maneuvering within and expanding the dominant ideology to embrace the potential for change. Both critical race theorists and intersectional feminists are descended from Crenshaw's work, most notably in the online space, Robin DiAngelo and her white fragility nonsense. But there's tons of people out there who view subversive action against liberal society as an a priori good, and not just in terms of critical race theory. For example, you can look at critical queer theory and find people talking about how earlier waves of gay and trans activism were assimilationist in nature because they focused on trying to make hegemonic culture accept them through things like normalizing gay marriage or appealing to the stereotypical hyperfemininity of a trans woman, when what they should have been doing is engaging in the most disruptive, degenerate behaviors imaginable in order to foster a counterculture that can oppose bourgeois hegemony. But that is a whole extra can of worms I'm gonna have to cover another day. The point is, critical theory as a movement, as well as the Frankfurt School before it, view the liberals' attempt to build a neutral space where ideas can be debated and considered as a weakness that socialists can exploit in order to begin the process of tearing liberalism down. And all you have to do is read their writing to see it. Crenshaw wrote, "Black people can afford neither to resign themselves to, nor to attack frontally, the legitimacy and the incoherence of the dominant ideology. The subordinate position of blacks in this society make it unlikely that African Americans will realize gains through the kind of direct challenge to the legitimacy of American liberal ideology that is now being waged by critical scholars." On the other hand, delegitimating race consciousness would be directly relevant to black needs, and this strategy will sometimes require the pragmatic use of liberal ideology. Marcuse said something similar in that long passage earlier from Counter-Revolution and Revolt, that the time of the wholesale rejection of the liberals has passed or is not yet to come, that protests against the war, inflation, and unemployment from a point of view of civil rights could be tolerated as a tactical deployment of liberal ideals to be used and discarded later, like how elections are a lesser evil. Critical theorists use their analytical method to destabilize liberal systems and prime them for revolution. They only appeal to liberal values and ethics insofar as it will help them achieve this goal. In case it's not yet clear that Sockdon Left is talking out of his gaping asshole for his entire article when he says conservatives are lying and grifting because they claim Gramsci said something he didn't say, even though socialists still believe in all of the underlying ethics anyway. I hope this is the final nail in the coffin regarding any assumptions of good faith on his part, or at the very least, that he actually reads any of the theory that he cites. There is a clear lineage from Antonio Gramsci to the present day. And the craziest thing about it all is, when I took that 2007 class, this stuff wasn't exactly kept secret, but it wasn't being shouted from the rooftops either. My professor made it clear that this was very serious, very subversive stuff, and while it wasn't to be kept under wraps, it was meant to make us critical theorists. He was clear about viewing his class as a political project, his contribution to the creation of counter-hegemony. It's only after my generation, the millennials, left university, entered the workforce, and began to implement this shit that wider society began to take notice, and the subversives began to panic. Here's one example of what I mean. If you go to the Wikipedia article on cultural Marxism, you'll get this passage. The term cultural Marxism refers to a far-right anti-Semitic conspiracy theory which claims that Western Marxism is the basis of continuing academic and intellectual efforts to subvert Western culture. The conspiracy theory misrepresents the Frankfurt School as being responsible for modern progressive movements, identity politics, and political correctness, claiming that there is an ongoing and intentional subversion of Western society via a planned culture war that undermines the Christian values of traditionalist conservatism and seeks to replace them with the culturally liberal values of the 1960s. although similarities with the Nazi propaganda term cultural Bolshevism has been noted, the contemporary conspiracy theory originated in the United States during the 1990s. Originally found only on the far-right political fringe, the term began to enter mainstream discourse in the 2010s and is now found globally. The conspiracy theory of a Marxist culture war is promoted by right-wing politicians, fundamentalist religious leaders, political commentators in mainstream print and television media, and white supremacist terrorists, and has been described as a foundational element of the alt-right worldview. Now, to me, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. In fact, it seems to be an outright lie, because my professor, back in 2007, explicitly referred to what we were talking about as cultural Marxism. It was not the name of some false conspiracy theory back then. It was what underpinned critical theory. We learned to attack aspects of hegemonic culture, mainly pop culture, let's be honest. It was an intro-level course, through media criticism meant to deconstruct and demoralize, with the long-term purpose being the creation of a space where an alternative and preferably socialist counterculture could form. The Wikipedia article frames this as if it's false and anti-Semitic and only neo-Nazis believe it or something, but in my experience, this is exactly what it is. And back then, they had no problem just outright saying it. What's really interesting is, if you look at the Cultural Marxism Wikipedia article from 2014, it's more or less accurate. Cultural Marxism is an offshoot of Marxism that conceives of culture as central to the legitimization of oppression, in addition to economic factors. An outgrowth of Western Marxism, especially from Antonio Gramsci and the Frankfurt School, cultural Marxism argues that what appears as traditional cultural phenomenon intrinsic to Western society, for instance capitalism, nationalism, the nuclear family, gender roles, race, and other forms of cultural identity, serve to justify and maintain hierarchy. Cultural Marxists use Marxist methods to make it possible to criticize what appears natural, but is in fact ideological. This is pretty much spot on. All of the writing I've referenced today shows it to be spot on. And you know what? Other, lesser-known Wikipedia articles still reinforce this too, but the article that everyone's been searching in the past few years, Cultural Marxism, is the one that's been changed to try and hide the smoke. The contents of the old Cultural Marxism page have just been moved to a new heading in Wikipedia called Marxist Cultural Analysis. This really is some "we're not doing it and it's good that it's happening" shit. On this page, the claim is made that the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory is an influential discourse on the far right without any clear relationship to Marxist cultural analysis. On the current Cultural Marxism page, a similar claim is made. Scholarly analysis of the conspiracy theory has concluded that the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory has no basis in fact. Both of these passages cite the article "Who's Afraid of the Frankfurt School? Cultural Marxism as an Anti-Semitic Conspiracy Theory" by Joanne Braun from the Journal of Social Justice. Okay, now this sounds like some "we've investigated ourselves and found we did nothing wrong" shit too. Of course, we should give the devil his due. I read the article and it's not very good. The article supports its claim that cultural Marxism is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory by focusing on 3 specific proponents of the theory and claiming that because they are anti-Semitic, the theory must also be anti-Semitic. These 3 people are Kevin MacDonald, William S. Lind, and Paul Gottfried. Regarding Kevin MacDonald, Braun is just correct. He is anti-Semitic, seemingly to the core. He's an evolutionary psychology professor, but he's most well known for a trilogy of books called The Culture of Critique, where he uses his evo-psych knowledge to claim that Jews have evolved to undermine the societies in which they live, as a form of biologically fixed extreme in-group preference. It's safe to say that this guy's a quack. For William S. Lind, Braun even admits that he doesn't focus his critique of cultural Marxism on the Jews, but that his theory does have what she calls anti-Semitic dimensions. These dimensions she's referring to is his use of the term globalist in his objections to international capitalism. Now, I personally don't know what that has to do with the Jews, because when I hear international capitalists, I don't think Jews, and I'm pretty sure that most people who use the word globalist isn't thinking Jews either. Nonetheless, Braun did dig up what she calls a Holocaust denial conference from back in 2002, where Lind made the remark that the people in the Frankfurt School were all Jews. I looked into this event, and it seems to actually have been a paleo-conservative conference. There were definitely some Holocaust deniers there, but Lind wasn't one of them, and he explicitly pointed out that disagreement in his speech. It may very well be the case that Lind is actually an anti-Semite, but not once does Jewishness come up in his discussions of cultural Marxism, and regardless of his motivations, his critique is solid and factual. Regarding Paul Gottfried, Braun's case is the weakest. She admits that Gottfried is Jewish himself and studied under Herbert Marcuse in his youth. The only points she can muster against him are ultimately irrelevant character attacks, like how he calls himself a paleoconservative, a term that he coined in fact, or how he mentored Richard Spencer. And Braun can't even make the emotional weight of that charge stick because she immediately admits that Spencer is far more extreme than Gottfried. But most importantly of all, even if all three of these men were vicious anti-Semites and open goose-stepping Nazis and all the rest of it, that doesn't make cultural Marxism an alt-right anti-Semitic fascist conspiracy theory, nor does it prove it to be factually incorrect. A correct thing is still correct, even if people that you find distasteful believe it. Beyond these three men, Braun seems to have no real argument except bad people believe this, therefore it's wrong. She claims that Anders Breivik was influenced by the idea to commit his shooting. And while that's certainly bad, that doesn't disprove the idea. She claims that Andrew Breitbart, Charlie Kirk, Ben Shapiro, Alex Jones, and Brazilian President Bolsonaro's son all believe in the theory, and that also doesn't disprove it. Braun then makes a list of very strange claims about cultural Marxism, including that 1. It is the source of viewing liberals and leftists as a part of the same category, as a common leftist talking point is that liberals are not leftists. If you think liberals and leftists are the same thing, you're a believer in cultural Marxism and you're a Nazi. 2. It is the source of criticism of psychoanalysis, because members of the Frankfurt School viewed the family as an authoritarian institution and psychology as liberation from it. And because the Nazis famously viewed psych as Jewish science, if you critique psych, you're a Nazi. 3. It's the source of the view that leftists sometimes engage in pro-pedophile activism, when, according to Braun, this never happens, and it's only ever sex ed in schools and accepting trans identities. So if you think it's happening because, you see it, you're a Nazi. It's really incredible just how much she gaslights the reader here. The entire foundation of this article is bad people believe in this idea, therefore it's false, and if you believe in it, you're bad too, which is pretty dogshit reasoning. If you believe in any of this stuff, and there is proof for it happening at least sometimes, then you're an alt-right neo-Nazi cultural Marxist believer who hates the Jews because you believe in, reality. That's it. That's the entire crux of her argument. Joanne Braun is a professor at Gonzaga University in the Department of Leadership Studies. You can actually get a leadership studies degree. As far as I can tell, it's all about teaching you how to be a socially conscious middle manager or HR department head. Jeez, and I thought my degree was worthless. She is, surprise, surprise, another academic descended from the Frankfurt School, and she focuses specifically on critical hate studies and intersections of religion and socialism. And normally I would not get into this because it's not relevant. Fuck you if you think I'm dog whistling here, but she's Jewish. A Jewish intellectual who believes that everybody who disagrees with her politics is a Nazi isn't somebody you can rely on for having an accurate view of this topic. Not because she's Jewish, you weirdos, but because she's biased. Cultural Marxism posits that leftist academics, artists, and activists, guided by Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony, are subverting liberal institutions to create counter-hegemony, and that their school of thought is the Frankfurt School. Leftist academics, artists, and activists are not only saying that this is false, despite the mountains of political writing to the contrary on the topic, but that you're an anti-Semite if you believe it. And the primary source justifying this belief that cultural Marxism is not only false, but inherently anti-Semitic, is a leftist academic, artist, and activist from the very same Frankfurt School being critiqued, who serves to benefit, both personally and politically, if everyone who believes in cultural Marxism is considered a Nazi by the public. And this is the scholarly source that Wikipedia leans on to make the claim that cultural Marxism is false and anti-Semitic. I have never seen a more precise reason as to why people tend to not trust academics and experts anymore. Most people, including Braun, claim that cultural Marxism as a conspiracy theory is a continuation of cultural Bolshevism or Judeo-Bolshevism, which actually was a real anti-Semitic conspiracy theory in Nazi Germany that accused Jewish intellectuals of using art and music to subvert German culture. The Nazis called the works degenerate art and used them to justify censoring speech and expression. They believed the revolution in Russia was a Jewish plot, due primarily to the involvement of Leon Trotsky, a Jewish Ukrainian socialist revolutionary that we've talked about at length on this channel before. The Nazis believed that the Jews were the parasitic element that was destroying the German working class, and that Soviet Russia was an example of that element's victory. Judeo-Bolshevism is actually an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. There is no evidence that Jewish intellectuals specifically used culture to undermine Germany. There is no evidence that Jewish people were actually parasitizing the German working class. There is no evidence that Bolsheviks in Russia were the culmination of a Jewish revolutionary plot. But while cultural Marxism follows the same basic form, revolutionaries using culture to subvert hegemony, it has nothing else in common with Judeo-Bolshevism. Neither Antonio Gramsci, nor Georgy Lukács, nor Rudi Dutschke were Jewish, and the Jewish origins of the Frankfurt School have nothing to do with their motivations. I didn't even mention it until this chapter of the video because it's not relevant. But most importantly of all, unlike with Judeo-Bolshevism, there is ample amounts of evidence across many different political theorists spanning nearly 100 years now that at least some socialists view cultural Marxism or Gramscian socialism or critical theory, or whatever you want to call it, as a viable path forward for their revolution. It seems to me that the people who are insisting that all of this stuff is just anti-Semitism and that you're a Nazi if you notice it's happening are simply making a last-ditch effort to try and preserve their growing counter-hegemony by shaming you into compliance through slander, justified in their minds by a non-existent connection to a previous anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that kinda looks similar if you really squint your eyes. And honestly, if some people are just really triggered by calling it cultural Marxism due to this trumped-up connection, fine. Call it Western Marxism. Call it Marxist cultural critique. Hell, you can even call it the infinitely more neutral institutional capture, since it's not like socialists are the only people who subvert liberal institutions when they can. The label doesn't matter. What matters is it's happening. And as liberals, we need to be aware that it's happening. And that brings us to the present day. So let's recap. Antonio Gramsci's experience with the factory workers' revolt, the Italian Socialist Party's reluctance to support them, and Mussolini taking advantage of that situation and winning the popular support of the Italian working class, led him to develop a theory of bourgeois cultural hegemony. The proletariat would never reach class consciousness as long as the bourgeois continued to culturally educate them against their own interests. So the job of the socialist revolutionary was to undermine the culture and subversively create countercultures to make the liberal state weak enough that a direct conflict could be won. Though Gramsci's prison notebooks did not actually get published until after his death, he did share his ideas around Vienna's socialist scene, greatly influencing Georgi Lukács, who became one of the Frankfurt School's founders. This ideological strain of Marxism would be called Western Marxism, to differentiate it from the Soviet-style Eastern Marxism. Both the members of the Frankfurt School, as well as other French intellectuals not strictly affiliated with it, were heavily influenced by this idea, and more formally developed Gramsci's ideas into a theory of subversion by a long march through liberal institutions. Academic, cultural, journalistic, legal, all of it. During the American period of the Frankfurt School, American contributions created critical legal theory, which originally began as a method of analyzing law, but was rapidly adopted to cultural analysis, critique, and activism. The discipline fractured across intersectional lines in the wake of neoconservatism's popularity, with the most well-known strain today being critical race theory, due to a push to have it taught in American schools, and a reaction to that attempt by the American right wing. But all throughout these transformations and differing theorists, it remains Gramscian at its core. Use critical analysis to expose hegemony's weaknesses, build countercultures to propagandize the masses, and soften liberal society in preparation for a revolution. Gramsci probably didn't consider that his theory would be used in the service of American racial minorities or sexual minorities, but he laid the groundwork that later people would adopt to establish their own subversive movements. Understanding all of this will help you properly contextualize a lot of the stuff we see nowadays on all levels of society. Look at something large, like diversity hires and quotas and affirmative action in society's largest institutions, from schools giving blatant racial privileges to minorities, or rainbow capitalism in the biggest companies in the world. Look at something medium-sized, like shitty, forced diversity, inclusion, and equity initiatives in pop culture and entertainment media, where the quality of the art takes a back seat to ensuring that minorities always take center stage, and leftist agitators demand that more cultural properties be ceded to their politics. Hell, look at something small, like the unending cancerous fucking discussions about appropriately platforming problematic people. On a personal level, I know my friend Stardust recently went through that, where she decided to talk to Richard Spencer on her stream, and some retard raked her over the coals for not using her 10,000 sub YouTube channel responsibly by his estimation. All of these disparate things flow from this source and serve this purpose: the desire to move the world more leftward, inch by inch, space by space, thought by thought. That is the primary objective. The second objective is, for those people and spaces that won't move leftward, or even just don't care, either demoralizing them until they capitulate, or isolating them until they radicalize, lose all their support, and become irrelevant. This is the reason why every single event has to push a leftist agenda or be considered fascist. This is the reason why liberals or centrists cannot remain unaligned. They have to be forced into one of two extremist camps, either to be propagandized as a fellow subversive, or to be identified as an enemy and destroyed. Now, none of this means that if, for example, a black person complains about being treated in a racist way, that's critical race theory, and it's part of the socialist subversion, and we need to stamp it out and enforce a strictly racist, pro-white culture or something. That also doesn't mean that two gay men getting married is inherently advancing the dialectic towards revolution either. The bulwark against this is ultimately liberal, colorblind, value-neutral policies, the very thing that Kimberly Crenshaw denounced as racist and sexist and right-wing in her writing. This is why when they say, you need to give my group special consideration, we need equity, not equality, you simply need to tell them, no. This is the roadmap that they want to travel down. They will appeal to liberal morality and sensibilities to get you to go down that path, but that's part of the subversion. And just like that often misattributed quote from the start of the video, they are looking to hang you with your own rope. To be a liberal means to stand by those colorblind, value-neutral policies, even as they look to use your compassion against you. It means to be tolerant of cultural differences and subcultures, but only to a point. You are under no moral obligation to foster a revolution against you. Engaging in Gramscian subversive tactics, but from the right wing, as a lot of dissident rightists are currently advocating for, will certainly swing the pendulum back around, but we will be faced with the exact same problem, only this time coming from the other direction. The solution is based in unapologetic liberalism. Whatever true crises that Gramscians and critical theorists identify with their analysis, liberalism can fix without the revolutionary prescriptions. There we go, that's my video on Antonio Gramsci. I've been talking about doing it for at least a year, but I didn't really start cracking open the prison notebooks seriously until summer of 2022. Also, Sock Done Left is either a midwit, or more likely, he's a subversive himself, who is saying it's not happening when he desperately wants it to happen. And speaking of him, I know I'm responding to a Twitter thread that is over a month old, but you know how the old saying goes, a lie can travel halfway around the world, while the truth is still putting on its shoes. Yes, I know, that quote is commonly misattributed to Mark Twain, but I think it's fitting to end this video the way we began it, on a commonly repeated quote that was never actually said, but its underlying message still remains factual. It doesn't matter though. I don't expect Sock Done Left to actually watch this or anything. He's already moved on to making newer, dumber takes on Twitter that would likely take me another month to debunk properly as well. To borrow a phrase, the socialist intellectual ecosystem is broken. Leftist grifters don't have to care about the truth.